A lot of the rules and requirements that are baked into the US system right now were sort of best attempts at the time when they came out, but they don't necessarily take into account the state of the art of knowledge of industry. And as you said, everything from converse guidelines to long-term sustainability guidelines that came out of the United Nations potentially. There's so much out there that we can draw from, and our goal is not to reinvent the wheel.
Hello, welcome to the Space Policy Show, brought to you by the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, part of the Aerospace Corporation. I'm Colleen Stover. This is the 5th episode in our Future Forward series, where we discuss topics from across the space sector that need to be addressed now in order to realize the future that we want. Things like planning for the science for humans' first mission to Mars, applying artificial intelligence to space, vulnerabilities in the supply chain, and even the players and changing budgets in the European space sector. All of our shows are at csps.aerospace.org. They are available on YouTube and all your favorite podcast platforms. So today's show is about mission authorization. Of course, activities in space aren't just government anymore. There are new and novel commercial activities like active debris removal, satellite servicing, commercial space stations, and many more. And the government stakeholders include FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration for launch and re-entry, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission for spectrum usage, even NOAA's Commercial Remote Sensing Office. And let's not forget Department of State, who helps us adhere to our international treaty obligations. So it is a lot. How does commercial licensing for these activities work in the US? And how can they be streamlined to better support industry? The Department of Commerce's Office of Space Commerce has recently proposed a novel solution for these novel activities. Today, Brain Weeden, CSPS Director for Civil and Commercial Policy, talks to Gabriel Swiney, the OSC's Director of Policy, Advocacy, and International Division. Let's get started.
Gabriel, thank you for joining me today to talk about this really important topic.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
So we're here today to talk about mission authorization, which is not a new issue. It's been going on for quite some time, as we'll go into. But the latest development is that the Department of Commerce has released a new proposal on how they want to address that. Before we get into that, can we talk a little bit about what mission authorization is and why this is important? From your perspective, working at the Department of Commerce, why is there a need to address this issue that we call mission authorization?
Yeah, thanks. And it's kind of a wonky term, mission authorization, but it really gets to the heart of what we, the United States, but more importantly, I think the commercial industry and really people around the world are trying to do in space. So I'll kind of step back and lay the scene here. The problem and the opportunity is that industry is starting to do things in space that they've never done before, right? For 50 something years from the dawn of the space age, there were really only two ways to make money in space. If you're a company, you could go and do communications of some kind. Traditionally that would be things like television, satellite TV from geostationary orbit, or more recently, that would be things like mega constellations providing broadband internet. Or you could be a remote sensing company, right? Go up and take pictures of the Earth and then sell those pictures or data or images of some kind. And those were really the only two ways to make money, other than being a contractor for government missions. So the US regulatory system over the years developed to address those two buckets of commercial activities. We have well-developed systems for regulating radio frequency telecoms through the FCC, and then my own office in the US Department of Commerce regulates remote sensing. But now I think we all know, if you follow space, industry and news, industry is doing all kinds of stuff, from satellite servicing to in-space manufacturing. They're also core to US government missions, right? Commercial lunar landers from the CLIPS program, commercial space stations. The list kind of goes on. And that's awesome. And like I said, it's critical to things like the Artemis program, but also the US economy. But our government doesn't have a clear way of what I like to say is getting to yes for those missions, right? If you're a company and you want to do one of those novel activities, people sometimes use that phrase novel activity, you don't know if you apply to get a launch license or a frequency license, what the requirements will be, because we have a system that just doesn't have rules or requirements or a pathway to do that stuff. So it causes really two problems. One is this lack of uncertainty, which chills investment and makes it harder, if not impossible, for companies to do all this new stuff. But also, they have to deal with an existing kind of legacy system of regulations that do apply some things having to do with remote sensing and frequencies and launch safety, with lots of overlapping, sometimes inconsistent requirements on different timelines and different paths. So you have this uncertainty in what the rules are, but the rules that do exist are a little bit of a mess at the same time. So addressing that set of problems is what mission authorization is all about.
And as I hinted at, it didn't just come about in the last year, although we have increasingly seen more and more companies wanting to do the kinds of novel activities you described. But about 10 years ago, there was a request from Congress to the then Obama administration asking what they should do about this. And they originally came to this concept of mission authorization. And since then, administrations have talked about it and put forward ideas. Where in your case, in the current Trump administration, there was an executive order that directed you to the Department of Commerce to relook at this issue and come up with a new proposal. Is there anything different about this time around as opposed to where it was approached in previous administrations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two main differences behind why previous attempts have failed and why I'm pretty confident that our approach is the way to go, and I feel confident about it succeeding. In the past, and as you said, there's been multiple attempts to address this. Congress itself has had draft bills. Jim Bridenstine was a big champion of trying to fix this many years ago. And yes, previous administrations have tried to do this, not just Obama, but the Biden administration also had a proposal. They've all failed, I would say, because one, there was a constant battle or debate both within industry and government about who should be doing this. The who question, is it FAA? Is it Department of Commerce? Is it FCC? And there was lots of opinions, some of which had nothing to do with substance and had more to do with things like congressional committees of jurisdiction, or which regulator did a particular slice of industry feel most comfortable with. Finally, we got past the who conversation, and there's been a real crystallization in recent years that commerce should be the lead on this. And we hear this very strongly from industry. It's flattering to hear how industry comes to us and tells us that they trust us to take on this mission. So this really is a lot of credit to industry for driving a solution to that question of who. But the other real sea change that I've seen very recently is the cooperation inside the executive branch. The regulators who do exist and still have critical roles to play, from the FAA and FCC, my own colleagues in our remote sensing regulatory office, have all come together to, sort of a Captain Planet style by our powers combined thing. And when we get into the specifics of the proposal, I think you'll see it requires that. So that level of interagency cooperation is frankly new. It's not about turf. It's not about each agency trying to maximize its own influence and power. It's really about getting to the right answer. I think those two things coming together have made things possible in a way I haven't seen in my career to date.
And that kind of interagency coordination and discussion is important because, as you said, there are existing authorities that are distributed across multiple agencies. And barring action from Congress, those remain, right? So as you said, you have to be able to find a way to get those different agencies who maybe have different slices of this problem or different interests or obligations to kind of work together.
No, that's absolutely right. The FCC has a statutory obligation and all the expertise, frankly, to coordinate things like radio frequency spectrum. That's critical, not something anyone else knows as well about, and they have to do that by a matter of law. FAA, same thing for launch and reentry, particularly when it comes to protecting safety of lives and property on the ground and in the atmosphere. And then, of course, CRISRA for national security and other issues related to Earth observation. As you said, Congress has not acted despite all their previous attempts. They actually haven't changed the rules. So those authorities all remain in place. And what we were challenged with doing is finding a way to satisfy those obligations, given the existing legal rules, but also provide clarity and, to the extent we can, clean up this this sort of distributed system as much as possible.
So the proposal you that your office unveiled, talk through what is in it and what are some of the big highlights of the proposal that you've been putting together versus what has been tried in the past.
Yeah, we're really excited. The proposal is essentially a certification process. We call it space commerce certification. And I should say, we don't have a law behind it, so this is voluntary. Companies can choose to go through it. But I think as I explain it, you'll see why they would hopefully choose to do that. It was really inspired by things like fair trade certifications, quite frankly. If you go to the grocery store and buy a bag of coffee and it's fair trade certified, you know that that company has met certain requirements that were articulated in advance, and it lets you know that they behave in certain ways. And that's exactly the kind of thing we're thinking to do. We are developing a certification process that will develop and articulate some light touch requirements for companies that want to do these novel space activities, whether it's in space servicing or lunar surface operations or whatever. We'll articulate those requirements. Companies will submit an application and certify that they will do, or they'll commit to doing those certain things, behaving in a certain way. We would then do some basic due diligence, make sure that that's plausible and true to the best extent that we can. We would also circulate the application to the interagency, give agencies like the Department of War and NASA and State Department the opportunity to flag issues or equities that they might have. Assuming there's no problems with any of that, we would then issue a certification. And we've committed to issuing that certification within 120 days, sort of a hard line. It could be extended one time by interagency colleagues if they need more time to work through an issue, but that's it. And we also would take lack of response from our interagency partners as no objection. So this is responding to some very clear calls from industry for presumption of approval, hard timelines, and that's exactly what we've proposed. So they would get this certification, and we have a cute little logo that you can find on our website, a little ribbon logo. But the certification isn't just a piece of paper, and I think this is the real secret sauce of what we've developed. It comes with at least 2 carrots. We've worked really closely with our interagency colleagues, and the idea is when you are certified, you can then take that certification. Of course, we would actually send it directly to the interagency, but you could take your certification to, let's say, the FAA. And if you've been certified by us, well, that already meets, we'll build the process so that it already meets the requirements of a payload review. A payload review that you would normally, under today's system, have to go through for every payload. Well, the FAA can just say, and they've told us, they could accept this certification as a means of compliance for the payload review. So that's another process you don't have to go through. Same thing with the FCC. The FCC has told us that if we build this right, they might be able to waive some or all of their orbital debris, end of life, and other space safety related requirements, and really just focus their authorities on spectrum, which is something we have no authority or expertise to do. So you'd have a much more narrow set of requirements over there from the FCC. The idea then is that when it comes to in-space behavior, setting aside launch and reentry, which is clearly FAA, setting aside frequency, and communications, which is clearly FCC, but all that other in-space behavior stuff would all be articulated through our process in advance, providing certainty and really simplifying the process for applicants, and ideally eliminating a lot of those confusing overlapping requirements, because we would have developed, and we have developed, a unified single application process.
And that seems to me to actually be a new innovation, because as you said, there are some of these authorities that are explicit in authorization, the frequency, the launch, the reentry, but over the last 30 or so years, there have been other things that have come into play, like orbital debris mitigation, other sorts of space sustainability and safety standards that we've added on to the licensing framework as agencies because they were important things to do, but we didn't really have a home for them. So what you're saying is that the idea is that those other things that are being done by maybe the FAA and the FCC and NOAA would be all done by Office of Space Commerce in perhaps a more, hopefully, a more coherent way across everything. Is that the
Exactly.
idea?
Exactly. These are legitimate government interests and equities, things like protecting NASA operations or protecting national security. but there's no reason we can't, and we really should do all this at once, right? One set of reviews to find if there's problems, and then give, ideally, the company, industry a chance to mitigate those or tell them what the rules and requirements are, rather than, as the system is now, frankly, lots of parts of the US government getting multiple bites at the apple, looking at applications for different purposes at different times. It drags things out, provides really a black box for industry, which frustrates them. This is a chance, at least with novel activities, to consolidate all that stuff, look at those totally legitimate issues and equities for the US government, but do it once in a clear and transparent way so that these companies, like I said, can get to yes, or on the rare chance that it's a no, we can tell them what's wrong and they can fix it.
Mm-hmm. And I think you, as you mentioned, as you went through this wasn't just, your office kind of working alone. You talked with other agencies, but I believe you also did some engagements with industry to get feedback that fed into this process, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, industry has been, I would say, almost begging for a solution to this problem for well over a decade. But more recently, we've really been engaging heavily with everything from individual companies, satellite servicing companies, in-space, commercial space station companies, but also the industry associations and some of the standards organizations as well, like Commercial Space Federation, AIA, confers. A lot of these groups and individual companies have a huge amount of expertise, and they're the ones having to live this saga of getting things licensed. So we've really been listening to them, sitting down, asking for comments over and over and over again, asking what do they wish this world looked like when it comes to the regulatory and policy aspect of the US government. And they've told us very clearly what they need. I said things, like presumption of approval, clear timelines, no black box, single processes, lack of overlap, and duplicative requirements. That's what they've asked for. And a lot of the ideas that ultimately turned into our certification process really come directly from industry. And we have put the proposal out this week asking for additional feedback, and we're already starting to get some. And so far, it's all overwhelmingly positive. I would say entirely positive so far. I like to think that's because we really have listened and channeled the needs and desires of industry. Part of the mission, the statutory mission of the Office of Space Commerce, is to advance the interests of US industry. And we see this as a very concrete example of doing this. We're not just doing it to meet, the needs of authorizing and supervising under the Outer Space Treaty, or because there's an annoying gap in the law. We're doing this because this is what industry needs. So it's critical that the solution we develop does actually meet the needs of them. And so far, it sounds like it is.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point you mentioned there, that there is an obligation by the U.S. government to authorize these outer space activities, both by the government and by private sector, under the Outer Space Treaty. And so, as you just said, you see this as part of how commerce is ensuring the United States is fulfilling that obligation, correct?
It's not that we haven't been fulfilling that obligation to date. It's just that we've been doing it through a very jury-rigged system, right? Relying on this kind of dispersed, overlapping authorities. So we need to say, what does authorization and supervision look like for all these novel activities, rather than kind of dealing with it on a one-off basis, finding some way to authorize, but in sort of an unclear way for each mission every time. That maybe meets the treaty obligations. I think we would say it does, but that is not business friendly. So yes, this is driven in part by, fulfilling the Outer Space Treaty, but really driven far more on our side by providing that certainty to industry.
I think what strikes me about this topic is, in my mind, it's one of the few areas where the United States did not have a process in place before other countries, right? You gave the other examples, talk about launch and remote sensing, where the U.S. really led the creation of this. There have been a few other countries, comes to mind Japan, New Zealand, the UK, that have been thinking about their own, I'll call it, mission authorization process for these novel activities. Did you look at those at all in this process and kind of see how these other countries were approaching it? Or were you mainly focused on what the U.S. industry and what the U.S. Interagency were saying needed to be covered?
And we absolutely look at the other countries, particularly in the sense of global competitiveness. Frankly, in many ways, the U.S. is a victim of our own early success here. We developed these licensing systems years ago because U.S. industry led the world in space activities. But that meant we developed those systems in a time when these novel activities weren't occurring. Newer actors, countries that are coming to space or particularly commercial space more recently, have adopted far more unified sort of single pathway regulatory systems that are in many cases much faster and provide a lot more certainty and are more business friendly sometimes than our own legacy regulations. So that's a concern. We obviously want the United States to be and remain the flag and jurisdiction of choice for commercial space. So seeing that proliferation of unified, simple systems around the world was definitely an inspiration in terms of content, but also in terms of sort of drive and motivation for why we want to do this. Make sure that industry feels comfortable operating out of the United States, while still, of course, protecting those legitimate equities of the United States government.
Yeah, what comes to mind is we think about infrastructure like power lines and roads or internet technologies. There's the concept of leapfrogging, right? That those that are early in might then end up with kind of very complicated, complex systems that have accrued over time. Whereas if somebody comes in maybe a generations later, they can lay out a cleaner framework, and that's almost what you're talking about in a regulatory sense. That the U.S. has had such a robust process in place for such a long time that this is an opportunity to kind of clean up some of that cruft, maybe.
Absolutely. You're seeing countries like Japan, for example, have a really strong interest in some aspects of commercial space activities. And in Japan's case, it's satellite servicing, driven largely by some of their companies that are based in Japan. And they've articulated a full set of requirements for satellite servicing missions. That's great. That's not a bad thing. That's exactly the kind of thing we think industry needs. But we don't want Japan to be the only one, right? We want to get there and do it. So we are absolutely talking with particularly close allies and partners like Japan, some of our European counterparts, Australia, New Zealand, on what the content should be. And I do think it's important, if we're talking about the international side, as much as possible for these requirements that we develop as part of our certification process to align with those of particularly allies and partners to the extent possible and to the extent that substance makes sense. Because of course we want US companies to, be here and operate out of the United States, but we want them to be able to sell and operate abroad too. So if we can make our requirements similar, if not identical, to those for operating in Australia or New Zealand or wherever, that's good for business as well. So this isn't just an opportunity to clean up our own house, but it's also an opportunity to make things easier for the US private sector to operate globally. So they don't have different rules wherever they go.
Yeah, and that's, as you mentioned, that's kind of increasingly important because space is not just an American economy thing, it's a global economy thing. And we're seeing lots of companies in the US and elsewhere that want to do business across borders to, service other satellites or dock with other satellites or pull down products from other satellites, whatever it may be. And so I guess what you're aiming for is this is perhaps a step towards a little more harmonized approach between different countries so that we can enable that kind of international business?
That's certainly the goal. And if we don't try, we're not going to get there, right? We can't get there under the current system because ours is far too different. Our existing system is just too different from our foreign counterparts. So that's definitely the goal. It's also critical to have something in place because it's difficult to combat something with nothing. And what I mean by that is there are attempts by some jurisdictions to overregulate some of these activities, at least in our view. This makes me think of the draft European Union Space Act. For those who've been following this, the EU has issued a proposed space law that would cover any companies that want to either do business or sell services and goods into the European market. Obviously, that's a huge market. It's actually really important to the success of US businesses. So whatever laws the EU adopts for those companies, it's going to have a massive impact and will, in many ways, apply to US companies because they would need to be able to sell and do business in Europe. So the EU Space Act looks at a lot of these kinds of things, space safety and many other issues. We need to be able to go to Europe and say, we've got this. We have our own way and our specific rules may well be different. We are on this topic and we're regulating as appropriate under our jurisdiction and our judgment. So back off a little bit, or if you do think these are legitimate to regulate, accept our regulations as sufficient. And there's ways under European Union law to have sufficiency determinations that would allow that to work. So that's just to say there's tons of reasons kind of pushing us to do this because the entire global space community realizes these questions have to happen. We have to figure out what it looks like to behave appropriately in space for satellite servicing or whatever else. Other companies are sprinting ahead with that. So it's critical that we be there in that conversation as well. So we can push back where we need to, align where we can, and then meet our national goals as well.
So this proposal that was recently released, what's the next step for it? This obviously isn't the end of the process. This is just one more step in the process. You said you're looking for feedback. Is there going to be another iteration of this, or is there something else that you're thinking of kind of moving towards implementation?
Yeah, ultimately, deciding how we move forward is in the hands of the White House. And you mentioned the executive order last August, 14335, which is what tasked us with coming up with a proposal. And what we've done is come up with a proposal that we released. What we've been told is that the White House is interested in seeing industry and stakeholder feedback. So that's what we're doing right now. We really want to hear what that feedback is. Whether we would have another version, I think that depends on what the feedback is, right? If there's really good ideas or really serious concerns that we would hear that would suggest we need a different version or a tweak, we're certainly open to doing that. If it's overwhelmingly positive, maybe we don't need to. The ball would then be in the White House's court to decide whether to actually task us with implementing the proposal, right? Our current tasking is to come up with the proposal. So then presumably at some point through a process, White House would say, yes, Commerce, go do it. I can't give you a sort of a hard timeline for that. Obviously, there's a lot going on in space right now in the US government. So whenever that happens, the next steps, which we've already begun working on, I should say, we're not just kind of sitting around. Behind the scenes, we're working on detailed arrangements with our regulatory colleagues, the rest of the interagency, so that we think we could get to a place where we could start accepting certification applications really quickly, in a matter of weeks, not months, from once we get a final thumbs up from the White House.
That certainly sounds as something the industry would very much like. I think back to some of the original satellite servicing missions where it was multiple years of interagency discussions and reviews to be able to get them an approval to go forward. Because as you mentioned, this was a very, I'll say, ad hoc process, right? There was, the government wanted to get to say yes, but didn't really have a way to do so. So it took a lot of discussion. This sounds like it would be quite an improvement over that.
We certainly hope so. And we've been told to move fast. That's our clear direction from the White House. It's also our own goal, right? As the Department of Commerce, our goal is to support industry. What we expect, and the way we're kind of thinking about this, is kind of a nice benefit of the fact that this isn't backed by legislation. It's not a formal rulemaking or regulatory process, which means we get to be a lot more flexible. So what we're actually thinking is the first handful of applications, particularly for each, let's say, type of novel activity. So the first handful of satellite servicing missions or lunar surface missions, we literally want to sit down with the applicant across a table or across the screen and say, what should we be requiring of you? The way I phrase it actually is, what should we require of your competitors? But what does good behavior look like? These companies know what satellite servicing or whatever entails, and they know what's possible and what's not, and what failures and dangers exist. So we really want to work the licenses and the certifications with them hand in hand. So it's going to be super collaborative. And then over time, once we develop more, let's say, crystallized or clear requirements for certain types of operations, then those can kind of be set and we can make those clear, and companies will know that in advance. But the goal is to move extremely fast, particularly with the first set of certifications, but do it really collaboratively, really flexibly, and learn as we go. So, it's going to be a little bit of work. It's going to be some back and forth for these early entrants. The good news is I've heard from a bunch of companies that are excited to be almost guinea pigs for this process, because they recognize that this is a chance to shape norms and requirements for entire categories of space activities, and be, hand in hand in partnership with the government, rather than, as you said, months, if not years, of interagency black box stuff where eventually maybe you'll get a yes or a no or something else. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be industry in the room with us figuring this out collaboratively as a problem set.
Yeah, that brings up something else I think that is interesting about what's happened the last several years. Is I can think of several situations where there are industry practices and standards and recommendations that actually go beyond what some of the existing licensing requirements are. I'm thinking of things like the proposals for data sharing, avoiding collisions on orbit, some of even the orbital debris mitigation end of life measures. Some of those things that industry groups have come forward with actually go beyond what is hard coded in some of the government regulations, right? So there could be a situation where these industry groups say, no, 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 we think this should be the standard, which is actually more than what is currently exists.
Absolutely. This is a chance to, learn from all the practice and conversations and work that industry and many others have done in recent years. A lot of the rules and requirements that are baked into the US system right now were sort of best attempts at the time when they came out, but they don't necessarily take into account the state of the art of knowledge of industry. And as you said, everything from confers guidelines to long-term sustainability guidelines that came out of the United Nations potentially. There's so much out there that we can draw from. And our goal is not to reinvent the wheel. Absolutely not for commerce to impose our vision on the world. It's to look at industry and the state of the art and these standards organizations to the extent relevant and say, what is good behavior? I'm going to keep going back to this. What does good behavior look like? Collaboratively, what can we agree that looks like? And then let's bake it in. And no one knows better than those who have been doing this stuff for years and years. And so this is also an opportunity when it comes to the substance of the requirements to bring that in and not copy paste, but take what makes sense to sort of bake in to make a little bit more of a hard requirement and, put those requirements into an actual certification. So all that work, that's been done in terms of developing good practices and norms of behavior, well, we can give it some teeth. Don't want to give it all teeth, but some of it we will. And I think that's another exciting benefit of this certification process.
So you mentioned that at the moment, this is a voluntary certification process because Commerce does not have explicit authority to regulate from Congress. Do you see at some point that there will be a discussion with Congress about getting more explicit authorities?
I don't want to kind of get ahead of what this or a future administration would ask for or what Congress, I've definitely given up on predicting what Congress would do. I guess I would say, I hope that does become the conversation because that means we've succeeded, right? The goal here is for us to develop certifications that work, that provide that clarity and sort of solve those problems that I mentioned. Obviously, legislation that bakes in this system and kind of cleans up the rest of the regulatory structure can do things that we can't do on a voluntary basis. It can, snip out sort of overlapping bits of regulations, and ultimately you could require companies to go through this process. That's not something we can do. Only Congress can do those things. So yeah, there's strong benefits. And I think if our process is successful, which I feel fairly confident it will be, then I personally hope that, yeah, Congress looks at it and says, wow, good job, Commerce. That should be how it goes. And then they provide the relevant authorities. But we can do a huge amount without it. And like I said before, I actually think there's some benefits to not having legislation behind it, at least in this initial stage. It can be so much more collaborative and flexible without having to go through some formal notice and comment processes, for example.
And similarly, I'm assuming there's probably sort of some thoughts about how to socialize this internationally. Is this something that you think the U.S. will be bringing up at the next session of UN COPUOS, or maybe as part of the long-term sustainability implementation? Is that perhaps a pathway to get more countries aware of what's going on here?
Yeah, absolutely. And in addition to the industry support domestically, one of our missions in the office is to support U.S. industry abroad, and we engage extremely closely with our State Department colleagues. And I will attend some portion of the COPUOS legal subcommittee in a few weeks, so I'll have a chance to talk about this. Absolutely. A lot of the work that happens at places like the United Nations, but also other standards bodies, multilateral fora, but also just conversations bilaterally, is about what good behavior in space looks like. And the United States hasn't really had a good answer when those countries asked, okay, how do you implement this? Like America, you've agreed that, RPOs look like this. How do you make sure that happens? We actually have an answer now, right? And it's going to be a process and it's going to take some time, but we can actually say this is how the United States will implement things like LTS guidelines or whatever else. So yeah, there's huge interest. And as I said before, it's also an opportunity to align those requirements for our closest allies and partners, places like New Zealand and Australia. So absolutely. I will note also that some countries, although many have space laws or have kind of solved this bureaucratic problem on their own side, many others haven't. So they're also reaching out to us and asking, is there stuff we can learn from the US process? And what I'm telling them so far is do this collaboratively with your industry or with our industry or with the space industry. Government shouldn't be in a room with just each other trying to answer these questions. One thing we've learned is this works way better if you do it hand in hand with industry. So hopefully we can be an example for counterparts abroad when it comes to that kind of decision making as well.
As I think back to the evolution of the off-space commerce over the last several years, this is quite a big change in mission. It wasn't so long ago that off-space commerce was a couple of people and a less than $1 million budget, and now responsible for this oversight, certification of these new activities, as well as your mission to promote U.S. industry in general. How do you see the office taking on this responsibility in terms of resources? Is this something you're looking forward to, you can handle?
Yeah, it's an enormous increase in the mission set of the office. We were created years ago really to promote the remote sensing industry inside commerce to help support the mission, say more broadly, of NOAA. Over time, that mission set has expanded, and without kind of going through the bureaucratic journeys we've been through, we've bounced around different parts of NOAA.
That'd be a whole other podcast discussion that goes through that.
It's a whole thing of interest perhaps to historians. But the long story short is that now we are responsible for this. We also, as you said, are advocates domestically and abroad. We also absorbed the commercial remote sensing office, which is super relevant to this process. And of course, another portion of our office was tasked with solving the question of space situational awareness. And we have our TRACS program, and that is moving forward with incredible success as well. I think all of this, the single thread behind it all is that industry sees us as a part of the government that can help them succeed, right? That's the statutory mandate. And if you go back to our original statutory founding, it is that. It's to create and promote essentially a U.S. government environment and world environment where U.S. industry can succeed. And all of these bits and pieces, whether it's mission authorization or space situational awareness, that's all done with that motivation in mind. So you asked about staffing and resources. It's going to take people and time. The office has grown over time, and we certainly have plans internally about how we can implement this. We feel confidently that with the right people in the right seats, we can do it. It is going to be a lot lighter touch than a lot of the regulatory systems companies might be used to. So this is not going to be a hundreds of people kind of process like some of our regulatory brothers and sisters are around the US government. It's going to be as lean as it possibly can be, but it will, of course, require some amount of resources. So I won't speak to staffing and budget decisions, but we do have a plan, and we're certainly pursuing that side of the problem set at the same time that we're doing the substance.
Well, really appreciate you coming out today and discussing this with us. Again, I think it's a really important step in a process we've talked about that's going on for pretty much the last decade. So the next step, as you mentioned, is looking for that feedback on what your office has put out as a proposal.
Absolutely. You can go on our website, read the proposal itself. There's also a little button you can click to provide feedback. Or, of course, we're open to hearing from people or companies or groups that want to talk to us one-on-one. We'll also be setting up some listening sessions. So follow us on social media or check our website, and we'll set up some listening sessions in the coming weeks. It's going to be a full court press when it comes to engagement. So, yeah, that's the next step. And we really do want to hear from everybody about this.
Sounds like it's going to be a busy forthcoming few months. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for coming on to talk about this today.
Thank you, Brian. And thanks for having me on the podcast. This has been great.
Well, thank you, Brian and Gabriel. Industry needs certainty, while at the same time, government has both legal obligations and the desire to promote U.S. industry. So this proposed solution is voluntary, it's flexible, and don't forget, it's looking for your feedback. So I'm excited to see how this plays out. There are other shows in our Future Forward series, and also our deep research papers can be found at csps.aerospace.org. Subscribe to get notified, follow us on social media, and thank you very much for joining us again today.